Hey guys, we're going to be discussing Section A of the purchase contract, which is agency disclosure. So on A1, it goes into agency and it describes the definition, which is buyer and or seller in a real estate transaction in Hawaii may retain a real estate brokerage firm as their agent. In such case, buyer and or seller is represented by the brokerage firm and all its licensees. Hawaii law requires real estate licensees to disclose orally or in writing to seller and or buyer whom the licensee represents. The form of representation may be one of the following. A, seller's agent. Brokerage firm represents seller only unless a disclosed dual agency exists. Seller's agent owes the highest duties to seller, including confidentiality, loyalty, and due care and diligence. B, buyer's agent. Brokerage firm represents buyer only unless a disclosed dual agency exists. Buyer's agent owes the highest duties to buyer, including confidentiality, loyalty, and due care and diligence. C, dual agent. Brokerage firm represents both buyer and seller. This commonly occurs when licensees in the brokerage firm representing seller have buyer clients looking for types of property similar to seller's property. In such event, the brokerage firm and all its licensees represent both buyer and seller and are dual agents. Dual agents must remain neutral in negotiations and must not advance the interest of one party over the other. Written context, written consent is required under Hawaii law. CRR 221, which is the dual agency consent addendum. Or D, no agency representation buyer and or seller is a customer. So some couple things to note is, especially for new agents, you could be showing as a buyer a listing that happens to be with Keller Williams Honolulu. And in doing so, that is a dual agency, even though you personally have never met, spoken to, don't know, or don't represent the seller. And this represents some challenges too. So you want to make sure that even though you don't know who the seller is, you have to understand that that is in fact a situation whereby it's a dual agency, and the seller, even though you've not met them, is your client, and they're your client because they're with Keller Williams Honolulu. So everything that paragraph A1C under dual agency is applicable in that circumstance. So you have to tread lightly in those scenarios. Moving to A2, which is a disclosure portion of it, NAR Code of Ethics, buyer and seller are aware that the National Association of Realtors holds its members accountable for their actions through a strict professional code of ethics, which includes a grievance system to address complaints. Non-members are not held to the same standards as members, nor are they required to participate in the grievance system. And so if you are a realtor and a member of NAR, which all of you guys are, that's what that's specifying. So there are some small independent companies and brokerage firms that are not members of that, and they're not held to the same standards as members are. So we are held to a higher standard, which is good for the public, right? A2 disclosure, A2A, and there's a checkbox you'll notice here too. So you're gonna, if it's applicable, seller representation, seller is represented by the brokerage firm blank and all its licensees. Brokerage firm is or is not a member of NAR. And so if you are writing and originating and crafting this purchase contract, the information that's going to go in A2A is going to be coming from the MLS. So on the MLS, when you see the information on who is the listing firm, you're going to put that firm ABC. You know, the real estate is going to go in section A2A. A2B, buyer representation. Buyer is represented by the brokerage firm blank and all its licensees. Brokerage firm is or is not a member of National Association of Realtors. So if you're the one that's crafting this document, more than likely you're going to be putting A2B as Keller Williams Honolulu. Or in some circumstances, if it's A2C, which is dual agency representation, seller and buyer are represented by the brokerage firm blank and all its licensees. Brokerage firm is or is not a member of National Association of Realtors. A separate dual agency consent addendum is required. And so what this simply means is if you are writing this purchase contract and on the MLS it says that the listing brokerage firm is Keller Williams Honolulu, A2A and A2B are going to be NA, which is not applicable. And the reason why it's going to be not applicable is you're simply going to check C, A2C, which is dual agency. So you don't need to, it's really going to be either A and B. for the most part, or C. It's usually not a combination, and I'll explain when it may or may not be. Moving on to A to D, which is customer. The difference between a client and a customer is a client we have fiduciary responsibility to, while with a customer and a client, we still owe professionalism and confidentiality and honesty and fair dealings. The client, we have fiduciary responsibility to. So that's a significant thing. And so, as an example, you may run into a situation where you are writing an offer on a for sale by owner, which is also called a FISBO. And in that scenario, on A2A, that is going to be NA because there is no representation. So you're going to be NA. You're also going to in the blank where it says the firm, you're going to put NA there as well. And A2B, you're going to have a check. And yes, we are a member of a National Association of Realtors, and the brokerage firm would be Keller Williams Honolulu. In A2C would be NA. The brokerage firm area would be NA. And then in A2D, you're going to also check that too. And then in this scenario where you might be writing an offer on a FISBO, you're also going to check where it says seller, where it says seller is not represented by a brokerage firm, for example, for sale by owner. Also, buyer is not represented by a brokerage firm is a possibility. Depends on the certain scenario. You could have something whereby you have a listing, but the buyer chooses not to on purpose hire or select a real estate agent. And in that case, it would be a little bit in reverse, whereby you would have A2A checked off, Keller Williams Honolulu. Everything else, B, C, would be NA. But D would be checked. Seller would be NA, but buyer would be checked. And that would be, again, in the scenario where there's a buyer, maybe he comes into an open house and he says, I absolutely do not want to work with a real estate agent. I want to represent myself. In that case, he would be a customer. Speak with your broker, the PB, if you have any questions about that, and we can explain that to you further. It goes on, buyer and seller acknowledge that oral or written disclosure relative to agency representation was provided to them before the signing of this purchase contract. And that simply means, guys, that you need to explain to your client who you represent and who's on the other side of that representation. It is recommended that buyers and sellers consult with legal counsel prior to signing a purchase contract. Initials below are for agency disclosure acknowledgement and page one review.